Dobrodošli, everyone. Most welcome to the Egypt residence, which actually happens also to be, of course, the African residence, especially that Egypt currently presides over the African Union 2019-2020. So we are very happy with that, and it's an integral part of our foreign policy, the regional mechanisms, be it the African Union on one side, the League of Arab States on the other side, and of course the surrounding and more extended concentric regional arrangement. We're always happy to host Conflux Center. I think, as I always told Ambassador Sugar, you bring in the multilateral flavor back to Belgrade, where it belongs very well, given the non-alignment movement heritage that it has, and now the increasing activity that this city is having on the multilateral front. Not too long ago, I think Belgrade hosted one of the largest meetings that it held on the multilateral front for years, the Interparliamentary Union Assembly, and it coincided with being the largest attended Interparliamentary Union Assembly in the history of that organization. So you can see how this city, with the credit that it has for many, many years, how it can actually bring back that flavor into it, and Conflux, I think, is doing a tremendous job in this, so it's always a pleasure. We hosted, I think, Conflux for one gathering that we called Geneva, but written with an NY, so G for Geneva, NY for New York, and VA for Vienna, as the multilateral chiefs of diplomatic missions that are in Belgrade, and there have been quite a few of them, so hopefully we'll continue that tradition along as well. The talk we suggested is to see how the UN and the African Union, the partnership that they could have in the field of peacekeeping. I think it's a very important aspect because, yes, it is on Africa, it is on the African Union, but also it can give a very good example or a model to follow for a whole Chapter 8 implementation. Is Africa probably more relevant in this context? I would say yes, for two reasons. First, the majority of the issues on the agenda of the Security Council are issues related to Africa, and the majority of peacekeeping missions and peacekeepers are on the African continent, to which you belong. So any experience and any lesson that we draw from the African continent becomes a very instructive one, simply because of the again, the size that it occupies on the conflict resolution arena, and particularly on the UN arena. But why is it also even more relevant? Because there are specificities to the African peace and security architecture that are probably unmatched anywhere else on the regional front. The first, it's comprehensiveness. You notice when we speak about the African conflict resolution regime or system, we speak about peace and security architecture. Unfortunately, we don't do that yet for the UN, because still at the UN we think of the peace of the Security Council, we think of the Peace Building Commission, and we speak about peacekeeping or peace building or peacemaking or mediation and so on and so forth. Not typical is our discourse about the UN as a comprehensive architecture. Now, the African Union, it's the other way around. The minute you speak about peace and security, you immediately link it to a unified architecture, which has, as you probably know well, 4 or 5 or 6 components. It really depends on how large you consider the architecture to be, but it includes, of course, the Peace and Security Council, the main organ at the African Union responsible for dealing with those issues, the Continental Early Warning System, so that is more the preventive, more the peace making, should we call it so, the Panel of the Wise, which is closer to mediation, so the softer way of intervention to address and solve regional disputes, and then the African Standby Force, which supposedly is no more the peacekeeping arm, although in the African context we would calling the peace support operations, and then you have the rapid deployment capability, which is supposed to deal with stabilization when there is that emergency leading to it. So you see that comprehensive 4 or 5 or 6 components, because there will be a 6th component that is established this year, and I will share that with you in a short while, gives that holistic perspective, the architecture perspective. And I wish that that would actually be perceived and implemented as such at the UN, and I don't think we use the terminology UN peace and security architecture often. I would claim, I think it's really right, that the first to use this within a UN discourse, Security Council discourse, was the Egyptian delegation when it was member of the Security Council 2015-2016. And it's exactly because we grew out of this African peace and security architecture that we felt that that form of design, that perspective can equally be applicable within the UN. So first, because it is comprehensive and interlinked. The second specificity of the African peace and security architecture compared to any other regional framework or even global framework is that it has an enforceability dimension that is probably higher than anywhere else. You know that the African Organization of African Union or Unity, which was transformed to during 1999, I think that was the easy way to remember it, to the African Union, moved from this non-interference into non-indifference, and it enabled through the constitutive act of the African Union at very grave circumstances of war crime or genocide or otherwise to actually intervene to protect the civilian populations and to prevent further violations. Now that aspect is probably one of the specificities of the African Union compared to any other regional mechanism, or even to the global mechanism if we take exception with Chapter 7 and its particularities in this regard. And that is why when you read the literature regarding African Union, you would hear more of peace support operations rather than UN peace or rather than peacekeeping operations, because it has that dimension that in particular specific circumstances can be used to intervene against any serious and grave violations. The third probably specificity of the African Union architecture or the African peace and security architecture is its configuration. We spoke today about that Chapter 8, I would say, yes, is applicable between global and regional, but the same approach can be applicable between continental and sub-regional. Because when the architecture was designed, it was envisaged as relying on the capabilities that are sub-regional, north, south, east, west, and central mainly, but there are other regional capabilities through the so-called regional economic communities, or when there is a lack of one, such as in the north, you don't have a regional economic community yet, although there was an attempt to do so, you would have a regional mechanism. So very much the continental architecture was supposed to be based on regional and sub-regional configurations, and that is becoming more and more institutionalized. I just saw that a meeting in Niamey was held on the 8th of July between those regional economic communities, regional mechanisms, and the continental overall African one. So again, that very interesting interplay between regional, sub-regional, and continental is also a very important specificity of the African peace and security architecture. And then finally, probably one last specificity is that there's an interesting interplay that just like at the UN, you have the limited membership Security Council and the universal membership General Assembly, but you have a very clear division of labor about when the Security Council is seized of a matter, then the General Assembly cannot, unless, of course, the Uniting for Peace mechanism and all what you know elsewhere. Now, in the African peace and security architecture, it's a little bit different. It's an interesting interplay, and I think we need to read very much into it more because you have the Peace and Security Council. But at the same time, probably the interventionist mode can only be operationalized through a decision at the assembly level. So you also have that interplay between the different organs within it. Okay, this is as much as the specificities go. Are there similarities? There are many similarities. Obviously, you have a Security Council and you have a Peace and Security Council. So you immediately have two organs whose mandate or whose expected mission or expected task is very similar. And that is why the two councils do meet regularly. I think once, if not twice a year. I think twice a year, probably at some point of time, through consultative meetings. And that is probably the only regional organ with whom the Security Council meets regularly for that long. The Arab League tried to have that, and it succeeded to have that finally for the first time in 70 years of the coexistence of the League of Arab States and the UN. It succeeded to have this under the presidency of Egypt in May of 2016, I believe, in Cairo, and it was the first such meeting between the two councils. But the African Union had been much, much more forthcoming and has had that form of interaction for a much longer period. You also have an interesting, to bring the similarities together, is that you have usually three African members of the Security Council, like the so-called A3, the African three. I think Egypt was probably the first one in 2016, 2017 to hold both membership, to be a member of the Peace and Security Council and also to be a member of the UN Security Council. Is that going to repeat more often? I think it should, because it really brings those two councils and those two visions together. Then on the different cornerstone of the African peace and security architecture, you would find some similarities. So you have the panel of the wise, and you have a mediation support unit within the UN, also starting to have more and more cooperation together. But you also have, it does not mirror all the time. So you have the Peace Building Commission, which was established 2005, 2006 at the UN. You don't yet have a similar structure for peace building on the African continent, except for the fact that finally a decision was taken by the African Union to establish the so-called AUPCRD, the African Union Post-Conflict and Reconstruction and Development Center, which by coincidence is going to be held, finally it was agreed that it would be held in Egypt, but we're currently finalizing the host country agreement. So when that is formalized, probably you would have that aspect of peace building, of sustainable peace, of post-conflict reconstruction and development, also well interlinked between the global UN level and the African level. And then you have even sometimes, if talking about the similarities or the engagement, we've had even a stronger, more clearer example of how the two organizations came together or come together through the so-called hybrid missions, such as UNAMID, where actually the two organizations contribute equally to a UN field mission. I don't know if anyone is from UNAMID in this group or not. So I would love to hear from you off the camera about how well this partnership is going, particularly in the field and on the ground. And similar to that, but not identical, is where the African Union or the African mechanism undertakes a mission and then hands it into the UN, the so-called rehatting exercise. Again, a very instructive one, and instructive in the form as should there be a division of labor where by the African Union mechanism are the first responders, they're the closest, they're the most engaged, the most affected, and then the UN comes through a rehatting to have the completion of the tasks. So sometimes hybrid missions, sometimes rehatting, there is that field merging between the two. But also you have that what the Secretary General of the UN assigns or nominates SRSGs, right, special representatives of the Secretary General, who are the heads of his field missions and his envoys, or her envoys. Hopefully we'll have a woman Secretary General at some point of time soon. But also the African Union, the Commission, and the other organs do assign and do nominate their own representatives. And in this, I was personally involved, and very luckily so, in the first ever exercise to bring all envoys to Africa under one roof. Because you have the SRSGs, who are the UN envoys, you have the representatives of the African Union, sometimes you have the EU representative of envoys, and then you have the Arab League envoys, and then you have even sometimes P5 envoys, American and US envoy, Russian, and so on and so forth. And they all speak about, they all deal with what? With Africa. Have they ever met under one roof? And probably the answer is, until 2010, Cairo, they had never met under one roof. Where the first envoy retreat, Envoys to Africa retreat, was held in Egypt for 3 consecutive years, and then I think it came back at the 4th time 2 years later or so. And I attended that. It was a marvelous experience. It's basically to get all those who are envoyed, I don't know if that word exists in English or not, to Africa, simply sit and talk and get to know each other, to have and to formulate, or at least to try to exchange on what could be a harmonized approach to it. So these are kind of the similarities or the platforms that gather UN mechanisms with their counterpart African mechanisms. Then there's the whole issue of finance. And that comes into, very much to the heart of the challenge of having the peacekeeping missions or peace-building missions or peace support operations or simply peace operations. And whether there should be, we did speak about a division of labor, there should be also a division of burden or sharing of burden between the two. Not an easy topic. You may remember Prodi, the former Prime Minister, I think, of Italy, when he issued his report with very ambitious ideas. Not much of them have been brought to implementation till now, but there have been at least some attempts to create, of course, the African Peace Fund on one side, and then you have the Peace Building Fund on the global side, and then there's been some talk also about the division of and burden sharing. The SG issues, the UN SG obviously issues a report yearly about this partnership and this shared responsibility with the shared task that they do. The last one is S 2019-759. So please have a look at it if you're interested into more details of this regard. So there is a lot to learn. It's not always, the UN is the largest umbrella, is where we all belong, but it's not always where all the lessons learned are. There are lessons learned elsewhere, and Africa is surely one of them. And I think already that cross-fertilization is happening, even as we say that probably in some time in the future, we will be speaking about a UN peace and security architecture, just as we spoke quite a few years ago, and we named quite a few years ago the African peace and security architecture. So you remind me of the good old days, when I was dealing with these issues. Again, if there's anything that's not up to date, forgive me for that. But I think it's important as political advisors, as peacekeepers in general, to be aware of that very sophisticated and developed experience of the African Union, and also to bring some of the lessons learned from there onto the global scale.